We're delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Karin Bowie, Professor of Early Modern Scottish History at the University of Glasgow, who is here to give a talk titled The Declaration of Arbroath and the Making of the 1707 Union. The 1320 Declaration of Arbroath re-entered Scottish political correctness in the late 17th century when translations from the original Latin were printed. After appearing in a pamphlet supporting the 1688-89 Williamite Revolution, the Declaration was quoted in a manifesto penned late in 1706 for an abortive rising to stop the Union of 1707. This talk will explore the aims of the author in sampling this famous letter and consider why his draft manifesto was never put into action. Over to you, Karin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessa, and thank you to you and your colleague, Jocelyn, for the invitation to speak tonight. Absolutely delighted to be here to reflect on the Declaration of Arbroath and its relationship to the 1707 Union as we recognize the 700th anniversary of this very famous document. So as we know, the Declaration of Arbroath was a letter written to the Pope in Latin in 1320, and then 4 centuries later, words from this letter were quoted and paraphrased in public discourse on the Union that was made in 1707. And I want to explore why these words from the Declaration of Arbroath were chosen and how they were used. And this will help us to understand the modern afterlife of the Declaration of Arbroath in 2 ways. So we're going to see how these union debates helped to bring the Declaration back into political consciousness after a period of obscurity. And we'll see how the Declaration was adapted to fit these more modern circumstances in 1706. So I'll begin by observing that this letter written in 1320 was very little noticed by chroniclers and historians until the first publication of a translation from the original Latin in 1680. And that translation then came into the political sphere in 1689. And you can see on the left of the screen here, the cover of an anonymous pamphlet which reprinted the Declaration in order to justify the overthrow of James VII of Scotland and II of England by reprinting this Declaration. We then had a new translation that was published in 1705 at a moment of really quite severe tension between Scotland and England. So an English author named William Atwood had argued that the English monarch held feudal superiority over the Scottish crown. And James Anderson replied with a book of documents which tried to show otherwise, and this included his own fresh translation of the Declaration of Arbroath. We also find that the 1689 pamphlet was reprinted again in 1706 in response to proposals for a closer union between Scotland and England. So we can see that this medieval letter was having a moment between 1689 and 1707. It was useful to the revolution by providing a justification for the overthrow of a king in the name of the people. And then it became useful from 1705 in providing a statement against English hegemony during debates on the Anglo-Scottish relationship. So these prints that you can see on the screen tell us that translations of the Arbroath letter were circulating among educated readers in 1706 when the Scottish Parliament started to consider a treaty of incorporating union with England. Now, if you stand back and you look at across all the pamphlets and petitions and speeches that were produced for and against that Treaty of Union in Scotland, you'll find that the Declaration does not actually appear very often in all of that discourse, but it does appear in some very significant places and moments. And one of those, and the one we'll focus on tonight, is a carefully selected quote from the Declaration of Arbroath in a scribbled document, which was written probably in November of 1706. In this paper, you can see just an extract from that document on the screen. And this whole document was found in papers belonging to Robert Wiley. And Robert Wiley was the minister of Hamilton Parish in Lanarkshire. The document seems to be in his handwriting. Now, Robert Wiley seems to have been writing a declaration to justify an armed march on Edinburgh. He wanted to raise the Scottish Parliament and stop the ratification of the Treaty of Union. And he chose to close this new declaration by quoting words from the Declaration of Arbroath. And he used James Anderson's 1705 translation, as you see on the screen, concluding with the words and resolution of our valiant ancestors relating to their noble champion, deliverer, and protector, King Robert Bruce. So long as 100 Scotsmen remain alive, we will never be subjected any manner of way to the dominion of England. It is not for glory, riches, and honors we fight, but for liberty, which no good man loses but with his life. So Wiley used these words to justify a rising to stop the Union, but his rising didn't happen. And this paper lay unnoticed in the National Library of Scotland until very recently, when I found it while researching Scottish public opinion on the Union. And I have to tell you, it took me a while to puzzle out Wiley's scribbles. This is definitely not a finished document, but eventually it became clear that it was a very important document. Because even though Wiley's rising didn't happen, his paper shows us that opposition to the treaty was more significant and more organized than historians had thought. Now, historians had known from a handful of sources that violent action had been considered late in 1706. And we knew that the government had taken measures to discourage those attempts. But because a march on Edinburgh never happened, it had become easy for historians to downplay the possibility. So Victorian and Edwardian historians preferred to consider popular opposition to the Union to simply be misguided and something to be essentially brushed to one side. Now, modern historians have paid more respect to popular opinion from the 1960s. But they tended to put a new emphasis on secret payments that were made to members of the Scottish Parliament. This suggested that the Union had been stitched up and that the nation had been betrayed by its elites. And this version of history suggested that the people had been powerless in the making of the Union. But Wiley's paper gives us new evidence of how serious plans for resistance were and suggests that the Union was perhaps more of a close-run thing than historians may have thought. So tonight, I want to tell the story of this attempted rising, and I want us to think about why Robert Wiley chose to quote these lines from the Declaration of Arbroath. So as we look back on the Declaration 700 years after it was written, we can see how this famous letter has been reinterpreted over time to serve evolving needs. So I'll start by briefly outlining the trajectory of the treaty, plans for the rising, and then we'll look more closely at Robert Wiley's draft declaration. So a Treaty of Union was negotiated early in 1706 by teams of negotiators who were handpicked by Queen Anne. And that treaty was then brought to the Scottish Parliament in October, 17th October 1706. Now the Queen was represented in Scotland by her commissioner, James Douglas, the second Duke of Queensberry. And he put together a coalition in support of the treaty. This ranged from committed unionists who believed in the treaty to opportunists and servants of the Queen who were willing to go along with it. And then Parliament began to vote on the articles one by one. There were 25 articles in all. Now, there were worries about the economy, and this led to the negotiation of some amendments on trade and taxation, mostly in November. There were also worries about the church, so an act was passed to maintain the Scottish National Church in the Union. This was to be a union of kingdoms and parliaments, but not churches. And so with those protections and amendments, the Parliament ratified the entire treaty on the 16th of January of 1707. So we're looking at a 3-month process, but within the first month, it became clear that the Queen had a majority and probably would succeed in passing the treaty. So by November, when we think Wiley's declaration was written, minds would have been turning to extraordinary measures to stop the treaty. So I want to just look at how the treaty was opposed and how a rising would have fit into this. So we can get a sense of Scottish opinion on the treaty from letters written before the Parliament opened in October. So one letter, for example, said that the trading people speak pretty favorably of union, but others were in a kind of suspense about it and know not what to think. So some were unionist, some were undecided, but many were against the treaty. More than one letter reported negative attitudes towards the treaty. And the opposition worked very hard to organize and weaponize negative public opinion. They published pamphlets from July of 1706, and they made speeches in Parliament from October. And in these, they claimed that the nation at large opposed the Union. And then they supported this with a petitioning campaign to evidence those claims. So 85 petitions were sent to the Scottish Parliament against the treaty from late October to January. And together these featured over 20,000 signatures. These came from the National Church, they came from the Company of Scotland. You may know the Company of Scotland better as the company that had set up a trading colony at Darien in Central America in the 1690s. These petitions came from about half of the shires in Scotland, about a third of the royal boroughs, another 9 towns, and a little over 50 parishes out of about 1,000 parishes in Scotland. These petitions geographically come from a swathe, mostly from the lowlands, from Galloway to Aberdeenshire. There was some Highland participation in Perthshire, which was encouraged by the Duke of Atholl. Now, you might think that that doesn't seem like a huge campaign, but in fact, for the time, this was an enormous petitioning campaign. It was a very unusual campaign and really should be recognized as a notable moment in the history of petitioning in the British kingdoms and Europe more widely. So if we take these petitions as an indication of significant negative opinion, that then suggests the potential for more violent action by petitioners. And indeed, more serious resistance is also suggested by protests and rioting that began to appear from late October. So we see rioting appearing in Edinburgh around the Parliament House when voting on the treaty began. We then see in Glasgow in November, the tradesmen organized a protest march in the city. And in Dumfries and then in Stirling, protesters built bonfires and burned the Articles of Union as an act of protest. And then in some parishes, the parish militias began to muster as a show of force. And this happened especially in Lanarkshire, where the parishes had been very active in petitioning. So all of this oppositional activity may seem impressive, but I do need to pause and explain that the opposition was split ideologically between Whigs and Jacobites. So they were either supporters of James VII and II, who's on the left of our slide, or and his son James, or Queen Anne on the right. I've already mentioned the revolution that overthrew James VII in 1689. This revolution also re-established a Presbyterian church in Scotland, and the Whigs supported this revolution. Many Whigs were Presbyterians who remained committed to Scotland's covenants, the 1638 National Covenant and the 1643 Solemn League and Covenant. They felt obliged by their covenant oaths to protect the Scottish Presbyterian Church and kingdom from closer union with England and its Episcopalian Church. On the other hand, the Jacobites objected to the revolution and wanted to restore James's son to the throne as James VIII. The Jacobites included Catholics, but they were mostly Episcopalian Protestants, and they wanted to restore an Episcopalian church in Scotland along with the Stuart monarchy. So those opposing the treaty in 1706 had very serious religious and political divisions arising from the revolution, and this made cooperation difficult. They managed to generate so many petitions because they created and shared a neutral text that didn't mention religion. And those of more Jacobite sympathies used that neutral text. But some of the parish and boroughs that were more fervently Whig and Presbyterian wrote their own texts in order to communicate that. But overall, that neutral text allowed them to cooperate in that petitioning campaign. And as long as the opposition focused on the shared issue of patriotic resistance to the treaty, then the Whigs and the Jacobites could work together. And so the Declaration of Arbroath was helpful in providing patriotic rhetoric from a moment in the distant past, well before the Reformation or the more recent revolution. But if religion or monarchy started to come into play, then the opposition struggled. So the problem was that the Jacobites wanted not just to stop the Union, but to make a new revolution against Queen Anne and the Presbyterian Church. And we have a memoir by a Jacobite member of the Scottish Parliament, George Lockhart of Carnwath. And he talks about how he hoped that Presbyterian resistance to the Union could open the door for the Jacobites to restore James VIII. And the Whigs knew this, and they were worried that aggressive action on their part might go too far. So a church minister expressed this in a letter. He wrote that Whigs and Jacobites, quote, might easily raise the Parliament, but how to separate them again when once in motion with so different views seems to be hard. And so this brings us back to Wiley's draft declaration for a rising. Wiley was taking a real risk to consider a rising. There was the personal risk of being charged with treason, which was punishable by death. And there was the risk that his rising would cascade into a Jacobite restoration in Scotland, which as a Whig, he would certainly not welcome. So Wiley tried to make his declaration safe for Queen Anne and the Presbyterian Church in two ways. So firstly, he focused on attacking the Scottish Parliament and its ratification of the treaty, rather than attacking Queen Anne, who had proposed the treaty. And secondly, when he argued that the nation was being betrayed by Parliament, he defined the nation as Presbyterian. His rhetoric simply excluded the Jacobites from Scottish nationhood and from his rising. And we can see this when we look at how Wiley used the Declaration of Arbroath in his new declaration. The Arbroath letter gave him very useful patriotic rhetoric, but he had to be careful in what he chose to use. Now, in 1320, the Arbroath letter had justified violent resistance to any Scottish king who betrayed Scotland to the English. Those of you who know the letter may be familiar with this famous part of it. Just before the lines about liberty that we've already quoted, the letter stated, "Yet if he," that is Robert Bruce, "should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own right and ours, and make some other man who is well able to defend us, our king." So this says that the Scots will depose any monarch who betrays them to the English. And Wiley needed to twist this. He certainly wasn't going to quote this bit directly. He needed to twist this idea so that it applied to the Parliament rather than to Queen Anne. He needed to establish the Parliament as the betrayer of Scotland. So he does this by arguing that a traitorous faction has taken control of the Scottish Parliament. He describes a faction in Scotland corrupted with arbitrary principles and pensions and English influence, having so far prevailed as in despite of all law, reason, honor, and conscience, to draw many others into the same infatuation and conspiracy with themselves. So he's basically describing a corrupted court party that has drawn others into this coalition for the treaty. And Wiley claimed that this unionist faction in Parliament was not representative of opinion at large. He argued that this faction was voting for the treaty, quote, against the known mind of the nation, their constituents, notwithstanding of the many earnest and weighty addresses, that is, petitions and remonstrances made to the contrary. So in effect, he is demanding parliamentary accountability to public opinion. And this is a very striking argument for the early 18th century. If you combine this with the petitioning campaigns, it represents a really significant moment in which public opinion is coming to the fore in Scottish political discourse. So for Wiley, the Scottish nation was compelled to take action to rescue their country from this factional parliament. He talks about we, the free people of Scotland, being required to appear for the relief of our betrayed and sinking country and to use our utmost endeavors for putting a stop to the proceedings of these betrayers. But for Wiley as a Whig, the free people of Scotland could only be Presbyterian. He excluded the Jacobites by defining true Scotsmen as those who had sworn Presbyterian covenant oaths. So again, he writes, "We as true Scotsmen and Christians, under the sense of the bonds of nature and our solemn oath to the Most High God, do only as a last and unsatisfactory remedy betake ourselves to arms." The people were bound by the sacred engagement of the most solemn covenants to maintain the truth and purity of religion and the Presbyterian government of the Church, as well as to preserve the rights and privileges of the Parliament and the liberties of the kingdom. And we can see how important religion is to Wiley by the way he puts it ahead of Parliament and kingdom. So Wiley is envisioning this popular uprising by a Presbyterian nation. But what does he want this to achieve? So essentially, he's envisioning a patriotic purge, but certainly not a Jacobite restoration. The declaration goes on to describe what would happen. Anne would be petitioned to reject the treaty. because the voting so far was not only without the consent, but contrary to the publicly expressed mind of the nation. Wiley argues that this factional majority had committed treason, and he cites a 1584 law which required the authority of the Scottish Parliament to be maintained. So it's not he who is being treasonous, it is the faction. So this faction would be expelled from the Parliament in a purge, and the Queen would call new elections so that the nation which disowns and testifies against their perfidy may elect faithful men as their representatives. So by closing this declaration with his quotation of the lines about liberty from the Declaration of Arbroath, Wiley was trying to justify illegal armed action in defense of Scotland's liberty. He was arguing that a faction in Parliament had betrayed the mind of the nation, and therefore armed action was justified to stop the treaty and purge Parliament. But as we've said, he had to define the nation as Presbyterian and Whig in order to exclude the Jacobites. So that's a close look at the declaration from Wiley and how he's using the Declaration of Arbroath within that, and how he has to adapt it to present circumstances. What we'll do now is look more closely at these plans for a rising and try to figure out how close Wiley came to being able to use his new declaration. So I've already mentioned the memoirs of George Lockhart of Carnwath, this member of Parliament who had Jacobite sympathies. And his memoirs tell us that both Presbyterians and Jacobites were thinking about a rising by November to try to stop the treaty. Lockhart reports that moves were made to raise what he describes as 7,000 or 8,000 Presbyterians from the southwest. They would march to Edinburgh, and at the same time, followers led by the Duke of Atholl from Perthshire would take Stirling Castle. Now, Wiley's declaration clearly was intended for this Presbyterian march on Edinburgh from the southwest. But from Lockhart's point of view, he hoped that French troops would then arrive and help turn that rising into a restoration of the son of James VII to the Scottish throne. Now, we do have other evidence suggesting plans for a Presbyterian march on Edinburgh. You may know that the English writer Daniel Defoe was sent to London to serve as a government spy during the parliamentary session. And he wrote a letter back to London on the 16th of November, in which he reported, "I dined today with a minister," that would be a church minister, "who told me were the weather permitting, they would have been at Edinburgh before now with 15,000 men. They exercise their men and appear with arms and drums at Glasgow." So that refers to the musters of the parish militias and the protest march at Glasgow. And indeed, these things tend to a strange conclusion. There are various other sources that make similar reports of a possible rising, especially from the southwest. Although some people were worried about whether it would actually happen. We have a letter written by Lady Catherine Skene from Edinburgh to her husband, who was the Duke of Atholl's brother. She wrote that there are great ferments and heats in this nation and a daily threatening that all the country will raise in arms, but I fear they will not do it when it comes to the push. So lots of talk about a rising, lots of plans for a rising, but would they actually do it? In fact, when it came to the push, they didn't do it, but this was because the government took some very effective steps to make sure it didn't happen. So the most important thing they did was put pressure on James Hamilton, 4th Duke of Hamilton. He was a key leader in the parliamentary opposition, and he was warned that his political career would be over if he succeeded in blocking the Union. So a letter written in December tells us that Hamilton had been plainly informed by his friends in England that the blame of the breaking of the Union is laid on him, and if it be broken, he must be ruined. Hamilton gave in to that pressure, it seems, because he wrote letters cancelling plans for a march from the southwest, and we know that from Lockhart of Carnwath's memoirs. Interestingly, about 45 people from Glasgow, led by a Jacobite, seem to have missed the memo. They marched to the intended rendezvous, which was the borough of Hamilton, and they got there on the 30th of November, and they clearly expected to meet others there. However, James's mother, Anne, the Duchess of Hamilton, sent them all home very quickly. Now, Anne had opposed the treaty. She had been active in encouraging petitioning and musters in Lanarkshire, but she drew the line at an illegal march on Edinburgh. She was not prepared to back that, and she sent this group back to Glasgow straight away. But at the same time, the government had already used secret agents to undermine the rising as well. So a very interesting figure, James Cunningham of Aiket in Ayrshire, was a former army major, a Presbyterian, a Whig, and he traveled around the Southwest encouraging the march and talking to the organizers. But we know that he was employed by the Duke of Queensberry as a double agent, and he got a secret payment of £100 from a fund of money that was sent up from London to help secure the Union. Cunningham clearly provided information to the government in Edinburgh on the plans for a rising from the Southwest. And in a very rare conjunction of sources, we actually have a statement, also in the National Library of Scotland, that Cunningham of Aiket made after the Union, where he explained what he was doing. He explained that he had been afraid England would conquer Scotland if the treaty was not made peacefully. So he infiltrated the rising as an agent in order to undermine it. So with the help of spy reports like those from Cunningham and others, in fact, the government took steps to block a rising. So one measure was that they took away any legal basis for gathering in arms by banning militia musters. So the parish musters could no longer happen after the 30th of November. And they also asked the government in London to organize English troops to be sent to Ulster and to the north of England so that they could be moved into Scotland in case of need. And they made sure that news of the troop movements was spread in Scotland so that anyone thinking about marching to Edinburgh would know that the troops were being readied to deal with anything they might be planning. So through this series of measures, the government succeeded in quashing this planned march on Edinburgh. And Wiley's draft declaration remained just a scribble to be discovered many, many years later. Now, I want to note just one last appearance for the Declaration of Arbroath in January of 1707. This was in the 16th of January when the treaty came to its final ratification. Now, in this case, the Arbroath letter was used by a Jacobite leader rather than a Whig, and this is the Duke of Atholl. And the Duke made a speech protesting against the ratification of the treaty and asserting that it would not be accepted as long as 100 Scots remained alive. So he again quoted those famous lines on liberty from the Declaration. Now, on this day, the opposition had planned a final gambit. The plan was that Atholl would make his protest and speech, the Duke of Hamilton would make a similar protest and speech, and then Hamilton would lead a withdrawal of the opposition from the Parliament. They would walk out of the Parliament House before the final vote could be taken. And the idea was that this would undermine the legitimacy of the final ratification. And it was really their last throw of the dice to stop the ratification. But on the day, it seems pressure again was applied to Hamilton. He first claimed a toothache and refused to go to the House. And when he was finally shamed by his friends into going, he simply refused to act. He didn't make his protest and he didn't lead the walkout, and the treaty was duly ratified. So we've looked today at Wiley's declaration and tried to put that in the context of oppositional activity and the potential for a rising against the ratification of the treaty. And so just to wrap this up, I want to reflect on what Wiley's use of the Declaration of Arbroath tells us about the legacy of this very famous medieval letter. Although Wiley's document remained secret at the time, it signals the start of a new awareness of the Declaration of Arbroath in modern times. And we'll just return to his quotation of that document as we draw this to a close. So historians have come to see the Declaration of Arbroath as a preeminent statement of medieval Scottish patriotism and national identity. And we've seen today how this letter from 1320 could provide patriotic rhetoric to justify resistance to the Treaty of Union. Now, the Declaration, in fact, wasn't widely used across the Union discourse. There were more mentions of the Wars of Independence, but not so much direct quotation of the Declaration of Arbroath. And this is because the letter had only recently been translated, only recently been published. But educated elites in Scotland knew their history. They would have recognized the significance of references to King Robert, and some would have recognized the specific phrases that were borrowed by Robert Wiley and the Duke of Atholl from the letter. And I think it's notable that the Declaration provided rhetorical material for both Jacobites and Whigs, though Wiley had to be careful in his use of the Declaration. And we've seen how he had to substitute Parliament for the monarch as the betrayer of the Scottish nation, and he defined the Scottish nation as Presbyterian. But he also linked the true Scotsman of the Declaration of Arbroath to a new concept of the mind of the nation. And this was part of a wider campaign against the treaty that placed an unusual emphasis on negative public opinion and made unusual demands for accountability from Parliament to the nation at large. Wiley used this to justify an armed march on Edinburgh, and although the government blocked this and it never actually happened, his declaration helps us to realize that the Union was a more close-run thing than historians have thought. Now, I think, as we bring it to a close, it's tempting to see Wiley's manifesto in romantic terms. You can see it as a stirring expression of Scottish patriotism. You could see it as an excitingly early expression of ideas of democratic accountability. But we do need to remember that this was a plan for illegal and violent armed action, and we should always be careful about romanticizing violence. And Neil Asherson makes this point. There's a recent collection of papers on the Declaration of Arbroath and its afterlife. And in this, he comments on Wiley's declaration, and he compares this plan to raise the Parliament in Edinburgh with the January 6th attack on the US Capitol building by supporters of Donald Trump. And this reminds us that one person's heroic uprising is another person's violent insurrection. But Neil Asherson also referred to what he called, quote, our habit of refunctioning ancient evidence to suit contemporary urges. That is our reinterpretation of the Declaration of Arbroath over time to meet new circumstances. So we've seen this in the episode we've explored today. And we can close by noting how the printing and the use of the Declaration in public debate on the Union helped to launch what became the modern afterlife of this very famous medieval letter. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
The recording has now stopped.